Hi, I'm Andy Brogan from Easier Inc. I've just had a fantastic day working with Helen Sanderson and her colleagues, where, shock horror, we've been working on governance. I was saying to Helen at the start today, if someone told me 4 years ago I'd be talking about governance, I would have laughed in their face. But times change, and I guess where I've got to is that governance is kind of an essential part of our organisations, and it's a way of reducing anxiety at all levels of the organisation. So we've been talking today about how can we do that, how can we provide assurance to others but also to ourselves, where we're habitually in the act of reflecting on our work and assuring ourselves that we're doing the right things and that it's achieving what we intend. So with that in mind, we've been working through and iterating on a framework, which you can see on the board here. The framework is underpinned first of all with the values that Helen and her colleagues have developed. So those live and breathe through everything that we've designed below, and particularly through the purpose of the organisation. So again, Helen with some of her colleagues had worked on a statement of purpose, which was described from the perspective of those that their organisation exists for. And it looks something like doing whatever it takes to help people live well in their lives and in their communities. So that starts us off over here on our framework with the purpose. And what we talked about this morning was just knowing our purpose isn't enough. We need to be able to put it into practice. Not only that, but just knowing our purpose isn't enough to keep all our stakeholders happy either. So when we think about what would be true if we were doing whatever it takes to help people live well, that implies one set of outcomes that are really, really important to us. So that's our outcomes here. But there are other outcomes that matter too. So we might think about Helen's organisation, and one of the things that will matter there is that they're able to live within their means. So we need to be paying attention to how do we generate revenue, also what costs do we incur, and ultimately do the books balance there. But there's more than money. There may be safety. So is the care we provide safe? For other stakeholders, the commissioners, for example, it may matter to them that the care we're providing meets the needs of their population, that it's sustainable, that it meets certain constraints that may be on them in terms of how they're measured, managed, regulated, and so on. So when we think about outcomes, outcomes are much more than purpose, but holding our purpose separate is kind of important, because if we're not achieving that, these other outcomes are for naught. So when we talked this morning, we talked about a process that I call left shifting, which is how do we get from our purpose through our outcomes and from all the complexity of all those many outcomes that matter to all those many stakeholders to what we might call our key processes. And when I described this morning, we talked about how if we spent today just working on who are our stakeholders, what matters to them, and what outcomes are important to them, we could spend all day just talking about that. And if you think about that suggests a level of complexity that is beyond being possible to manage. We can't manage each outcome separately. And we don't need to, because they're not separate, they're connected. They're connected because they're all a consequence of how we do the work that we do. So the really important thing is for us to work out what are the few things that we do in our work, the key processes, the key capabilities we have, that if we do them perfectly, these outcomes emerge as a consequence. So we don't need to manage the outcomes themselves, we need to manage the processes that create the outcomes. So we left shift from purpose through things that matter into those key processes, those few things we need to do perfectly. And if we're really smart at identifying those, the next left shift for us is what are the things that would make it easier, or what are the things that get in the way of us doing those key processes perfectly every time. So we call them the barriers. Now, there's a lot of common sense at work there, but again, we reflected this morning on how in organisations it's really easy to get stuck at different points in this left shifting process. So sometimes we might not be clear on our purpose at all, or we might define it from what we would call an inside out perspective. So we're not really grounded in our customers and the value we're here to create. Public service, of course, it's not really customers we talk about, it's people, it's communities, that sort of thing, but we need to be grounded in that perspective. Another place we might get stuck though is that we aren't clear around our outcomes and who our stakeholders are and what matters to them. Or maybe we are, but maybe we favour some stakeholders and some outcomes over others and end up, without meaning to, squeezing the balloon, shifting issues around, leaving some stakeholders feeling anxious, disenfranchised, and that creating problems. So if we want to work well and work well together, it's important that we really understand our stakeholders and what matters to them. Now, another thing that we can get stuck on is that we don't move left from the outcomes, and we end up doing what we call managing by results. So classic examples of that would be setting targets, or sitting in boardrooms, meeting rooms with our dashboard of measures and getting really preoccupied with what the number is rather than with what explains the number. So we talked this morning again about how this left shifting process needs to be a habit for looking at the numbers, understanding the numbers. That's really important. We can't do without that. But then using whatever the numbers are as a prompt to go and investigate. So to get out into the places where work happens and to understand what is it that's getting in the way, what is it that's making life more difficult than it could be. So we called that left shifting, and on the board behind me you can see a little sentence here which describes what left shifting is all about. So it's to build a shared understanding of what matters, why that matters, and what can get in the way of doing what matters. So in simple terms, that's left shifting. And it's not a one-off process, it's a process we do all of the time. So we've left shifted, we've got over here, we've understood what's getting in the way. What do we do now? Well, clearly we need to take action. We could call it right shifting if you like. We're going to take action here against the barriers that we've identified. And in doing the right shifting, there's a little bit of a rigour and a routine to this. We don't just do that and assume that we've succeeded. We might first of all act on the barrier and ask yourself the question, so is that barrier now reduced or gone? Yes or no? So let's assume we've been effective in acting on the barrier. The next thing we're going to do is ask, has that improved the capability of our key processes? It would be perfectly possible to act on something getting in the way here and actually it not be any easier here, because it could be there are several barriers that are interacting that are really locking us up. So it's important for us to just sense check that did the work we did here to make it easier actually make it easier. If it did, we can then ask the next question, which is, so it's easier, but is that helping us achieve more or better outcomes? It could be that we've made a mistake in our diagnosis of what we think our key processes are, what our capabilities are. So as we right shift, what we're doing is we're just checking that the action we've taken is leading to an impact. And the final step in our right shifting process is, even if we've successfully acted on a barrier, even if it's made it easier to do our key processes, and even if we're seeing an improvement in our data, let's just ask that ultimate question of, so are we delivering more purpose or purpose better for those that we're here to serve? Because we know that purpose isn't reducible to numbers. We can hit the numbers and miss the point. Okay, so that's our overarching process around governance. Left shifting, which is about building shared understanding, what matters, why, and what gets in the way. Right shifting, which is about creating the habits, the norms, and the routines that make paying attention to what matters systematic. So in describing those questions we might ask of ourselves as we go this way, we need to also create frameworks, habits, norms, and routines that make doing that easy, make doing that systematic. So again, when we spoke today, we talked about different ways we can do that. So one way is to make reflective practice absolutely normal. And the team did a brilliant job this afternoon in designing some reflective practices where we took, for example, some of the key processes of work and we talked about what statements or questions could we use in those processes to help us take stock and say, have we delivered the purpose of this process? So an example might be where we're delivering care to people and when we're meeting them for the first time, we have an initial conversation. And we want to understand in that conversation what matters to this person, what's going on in their life, what are the assets that are around them, be it family members or things they're good at or people in their community. And we want to understand all those sorts of things so that we have a really good grasp on how can we best support them and how can they best support themselves. So having had an initial conversation, we could use some statements to help us reflect on, did we do that well? Did we do it in a way that meets its purpose? And by making those explicit and by forming some routines around them, we can create that systematic habit for surfacing the barriers that affect our work and then talking about how we can do something about that. So systematic reflective practice is one thing, nailed down into some key statements that help us reflect accurately. The next thing though is, having done that work to reflect and to capture the barriers, we need to take that somewhere in order to take action. So we talked this morning again about, well, some of that can happen in a social space. You know, we're meeting over coffee, we're having conversations in the corridor, that sort of stuff, and that's really good. And it's really important, and it's a key function of leadership in my book, that we create those social spaces and we design to make it easy for them to happen. But I think it's also not enough. We need the formal spaces that allow us to come together. And by having those formal spaces, I think it's another way to reduce our anxiety and provide that assurance for ourselves and to each other that those conversations are going to happen and we're going to do it on purpose. So in the context of Wellbeing Teams, one of the key formal spaces is going to be a weekly team meeting for the Wellbeing team itself. That will be supported by other mechanisms too, but in the weekly meeting we're going to come together, and those who are helping people in the community live the life they want to lead are going to do three things. They're going to have a backward look first of all, and that's all about saying, how has this week gone? Was it a good week? Was it an unusually good week? Was it a bad week? Was it an unusually bad week? But the kind of litmus test here is that as a member of that team, I can look my colleagues in the eye and I can tell them the story of our performance, and I can do that with confidence, and that we share that story of performance. So in the weekly meeting, we're building some shared meaning around how are we performing, what's getting in the way, and do we mean the same things by that? So the backward look is about that. Second thing in the weekly meeting is the forward look. So in the forward look, we're thinking about what do we need to do in the next week, or perhaps even further ahead depending on our work. So most obviously the forward look could include things like scheduling our time, thinking about our capacity. So do we have colleagues we know are off sick and we need to respond to that? Are we maybe missing a colleague because we have a vacant post and we need to cover shifts? But also in the forward look, we talked about the nature of the citizens, the people that we're looking after, means that, you know, their level of kind of stability in their life could change and vary. So we've had this idea of what we're calling as an interim term, the worry board. We don't really like the title worry board because it's not really about worrying, it's about supporting people to live well rather than just managing the risk of them living badly. So we're going to retitle that, but the worry board is a simple way of visually representing where are the people that we're looking after, helping to support to live well, in terms of the level of concern we might have for them, or in terms of the level of independence and enjoyment they have in their life. So illustratively, we could have down one side of our worry board, who are we helping? And along the top of our worry board, we might have some column headings which are our level of concern for that person or the level of enjoyment they're having in their life. And by simply putting a sticky next to someone's name in one of those columns, we can get a really quick visual cue as to who maybe needs our help most versus who's feeling quite independent versus perhaps who's feeling quite independent but we've already been supporting intensively, and maybe we can do things to step back and allow them to become more independent. So that's the forward look, a mixture of planning our capacity but also planning where might we use that capacity to best effect. And the third component of our weekly team meeting is what we're calling opportunities to improve. So throughout the team meeting, what will happen is we'll be surfacing opportunities to improve, or maybe the barriers that get in our way. And as the meeting progresses, we'll capture those, but we'll not discuss them in detail until we get to this third component, where we take the time to say, okay, of all of that, are we agreed that those really are the issues? And we're also going to take the time to prioritise within those, because we want to put our investment of time into the things that make the biggest difference. And we recognise that as a principle, it would be much better to focus on getting a few improvements over the line really well than juggling a whole load of improvements and not really getting any done. So we're going to favour finishing over starting. We're going to work on what are the few things that we can make the biggest difference by improving, rather than doing too much all at once. And in particular, we're going to rely on the members of the team to do that prioritising themselves. So in the spirit of self-management and a culture of responsibility, we're going to support people to have the mechanisms through the reflective statements that we talked about up here, to bring to their weekly team meeting the things they know are getting in the way because they're directly experiencing it and directly reflecting on it. And then we're going to help them with the structure in the weekly meeting that makes it easy to talk about that stuff in a shared space, easy to prioritise that stuff together and to make sense of it together, and then easy to take action on it. So that leads us to this little thing here, which is our Kanban board, which is a bit of jargon that I don't particularly like, but Kanban is a very simple thing. It's just a way of saying there's stuff that we need to do, but we're not currently acting on. There's stuff that we're doing, we're acting on now, and there's stuff that we've already done. And when we spoke today, as we were working through this, we were saying, well, as the team meeting goes on, what we're really doing is we're generating our to-do list, our actions that we could take to improve. So when we get to item 3 in our weekly meeting agenda, we now have a list here of to-dos. And all we're really doing is prioritising which ones are we going to focus on, and then we're going to move them into doing. And as we do them, we're going to have some principles that govern how we frame those actions. So one thought today was that we might frame them as, even though the problem may be big, we'll break the action down to what can we do in the next week. So when we come back to the next weekly team meeting, it's really easy for us to hold each other to account and say, well, we only bit off what we could chew, therefore it's okay for us to expect it to be done. And as we progress, things will move to done and we can feed the pipe again with more to-dos. So that's the broad shape of our weekly meeting. And one of the things that we touched on as well with the team was there are going to be, amongst our opportunities to improve, things that don't really need a lot of planning or support. We can just do them. So there may be, for example, some practices that someone has developed. They go and have their initial conversation. They twig that a couple of questions would be really helpful to ask the person they're supporting, but they've never asked them before, and those questions work. So coming to the team meeting, that might be something that gets shared. Others think it'd be really good to try those questions with the people I'm supporting. So we're just going to do that. So we'll put it in the doing column. We'll run it as an experiment, we'll learn, and we'll come back and debrief next week. But we don't need other people to help us with that. By contrast, there might be stuff that we identify that feels like it needs quite a bit of planning, or actually it's not really in our direct control and we need support from outside. So for those things, while we'll capture them in our to-do column as the meeting goes on, the action we might take is to actually pass them on over to this side of our governance framework, which is where we have the wellbeing support teams. So these are teams that operate kind of a level back from this or that wellbeing team and maybe supporting a few. And they're going to have a very similar meeting structure, governance structure to the wellbeing teams themselves, in that they're going to come together weekly. They're going to have these 3 components of their weekly agenda, where they look back, they look forward, and they look at the opportunities to improve. But when they do that, when they look back, they may be looking at related but different data. They may be looking at things at a level of magnification that's kind of one level up of what are we seeing as patterns across teams, what's our performance in aggregate, not what's our performance in a locality. And similarly for the forward look, they're going to be looking at things that are similar but different. So for the forward look, they may be thinking things like, are we having a struggle in general recruiting to the roles that we have in wellbeing teams, and is there more strategic action we need to do to unlock that? They'll also be looking at things through their reflective practices for their roles, like if I have a particular responsibility for safeguarding, I'm going to be reflecting against statements that are about safeguarding, and I'm going to be thinking about, are we okay there? Are we on track? And I'm going to bring those things to my weekly wellbeing support team meeting. And around our opportunities to improve, some of those will be generated from the conversations I've just described, but some of them, as I touched on, will be generated from the wellbeing team meetings where they're escalated through for us to pay attention to here, where we're asking questions like, how can we best support our wellbeing teams and our wellbeing workers to make it easier for them? So what we're expecting and what we're liking so far about this framework is that it feels like there's a kind of reflection of what's happening here, also happening here, which I think will help us with a bit of a common language. It may help us as people progress in their roles as well. You know, if someone moves from a wellbeing team to wanting to support wellbeing team, it's not like they're stepping into an alien world of management. They're stepping into a very familiar world where we're having similar conversations, just at a different level of magnification. And the same may be true one step to the side of this, off the page, where, if you like, there's the macro level of the national work that we're doing through Helen and her colleagues. So there may indeed be other things that from the wellbeing support teams Kanban of to do, doing, done gets escalated one level further. So, as I said, there's kind of a lot of common sense at work here. It's not overly complicated. But what we're liking so far about the framework is this mirroring that happens, and also just this idea of left shifting and right shifting, and holding ourselves to account for not getting drawn into trying to fix measures, but remembering to use measures as a prompt to investigate, and trying to use the intelligence that creates to really just reconcile, are we making the difference that we're here to make by bringing it back to purpose? So I've really enjoyed my day with the team. I think they've done a fantastic job. They made it very easy for me to have fun taking them through this. Governance is a bit of a dry topic at times, but I think what we got to today was some very practical stuff that we can do, and we can do quickly. So I was really heartened when Michelle, one of the team here today, said that that's how she felt, that she felt like what she was doing was leaving the room with stuff that she could start tomorrow and that she felt would be useful tomorrow. So that made me feel good, and I'm feeling really excited about what we're going to learn by putting this into practice. So I hope you find it useful, and I hope you're going to stay posted as we post more of what we're learning as we go. Thanks very much for listening.